This program is brought to you by Emory University.
We continue to move from strength to strength to strength on this panel when we move to our third speaker, my distinguished brother and friend and colleague, Professor Robert Franklin. Professor Franklin is also President Franklin. Mr. President is how we normally speak about him because he was the president, a brilliant president of Morehouse College. He has stepped down from that position and now serves as director of the religion department at the Chautauqua Institution. He's just back from a year fellowship at Stanford University and the Martin Luther King Center, and we are absolutely thrilled that he's just been reappointed to Emory University, coming back home as the James T. and Berta R. Laney Chair in Moral Leadership. And we are happy to say in our own little shop that he's returning as a senior fellow in law and religion. Professor Franklin is one of the great public commentators and scholars of issues of social justice, of race relations, of the wisdom and theology of Martin Luther King Jr., and of the power of the African American communities of this country and of communities around the world in the cultivation and articulation and implementation of civil and human rights. You will have heard him many times on NPR, on various other public radio and television programs. You'll have seen his op-eds in the New York Times and other auspicious places. And you will read his books, which I commend warmly to you, with impressive titles such as this, Crisis in the Village, Restoring Hope in African American Communities, which we had the privilege of watching grow in front of our community of scholars working on a major project at the Law and Religion Center. Another title, Another Day's Journey, Black Churches Confronting the American Crisis. Liberating Visions, Human Fulfillment and the Social Justice in African American Thought. This is a man who has thought deeply about some of the hard questions that we are confronting on this panel and in this series of lectures today, and it's with great honor and privilege and pleasure that I introduce to you my distinguished friend, Professor Robert Franklin.
Thank you a great deal. I express my gratitude to my very distinguished colleagues on this panel. All of us have shared a bit of history in the past, and to the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, and most of all to the McDonald family for your generous and visionary investments in enabling these kinds of gatherings. The last time I was on this stage, some years ago, as John Witte has just noted, and two of my favorite and former professors, Martin Marty and Don Browning, were part of a year-long seminar convened by John Witte in the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. Since that time, my dear friend and my dissertation thesis advisor, Don Browning, has transitioned, as we say in the congregation world, from time to eternity. And so I respectfully dedicate my remarks to the life and legacy of Don S. Browning. Martin Luther King said these words, "The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and critic, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority." Now, my purpose today is twofold. First, I'd like to summarize and remind us of the remarkable public role played by religious people during the modern American civil rights movement. And I'll suggest that African people who were forcibly brought to North America carried with them an African sacred cosmos, playing on a concept developed by the sociologist of religion, C. Eric Lincoln. African sacred cosmos, a God and a spirit-centered orientation to reality, indeed a theonomist worldview that empowered them to embrace the foreign symbol system of American Southern Christianity and transform it for their and God's good purposes. Martin Luther King Jr. was not unique, but was one of a class of skillful interpreters who utilized biblical and Enlightenment sources to formulate theological, moral, philosophical, and legal arguments for African American liberty and justice. And secondly, I'd like to highlight the mass incarceration of young African American males and suggest that it is a crisis that will have longer-term negative consequences than any of us now imagines. To be sure, it is destabilizing and degrading entire communities, their many families, and, of course, sacrificing the potential of young, strong, untutored boys and men who've never had a fair chance at a productive, fulfilling life. But it is also reviving, mass incarceration is reviving a narrative of national humiliation that I suspect even the most conservative law enforcement and jurists do not wish to have ascribed to them as part of their career legacy. Ohio State law professor Michelle Alexander places a sharp point on this latter point. I quote, "There are more African Americans under correctional control today, in prison or in jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began." She continues, "As of 2004, more African American men were disenfranchised due to felon disenfranchisement laws than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws and explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race," end quote. So let us begin with the African sacred cosmos that served as an existential and ontological ground for Black resistance, sanity, and humanity. Those three, resistance, sanity, and humanity, when properly assembled, empower people to fight like hell to be free in the sight of God. The African sacred cosmos. The early Africans who brought with them convictions of their profound connection to God embraced the new Hebrew and Christian texts and themes. Soon they converted and developed a hermeneutic of liberation that was rooted in their relationship to a God that would never inflict suffering on innocent children, women, and men. Great teachers, from Howard Thurman, the theologian, to Congresswoman Barbara Jordan of Texas, and from James Cone, the systematic theologian of Union Seminary, to the womanist novelist Alice Walker, who all taught and illustrated that justice cannot long tolerate the torture and brutality of innocent people. It is an offense to ontology, the very nature of being, and demands confrontation and interruption. Even if the God of Western Christianity, or American Southern Christianity of the day, permitted and ordained slavery, oppression, and suffering, as many slaveholders and their pastors argued and justified, Africans had an alternative source of spiritual authority with which to critique the confusing theory and practices of American Southern Christianity. African traditional religion contained its own myths, symbols, ethics, and ritual practices that were untainted by the profit motive. Yale University historian Albert Rabbitoe has shown that the African spirituality fused beautifully and powerfully with Catholic popular piety in the West and Protestant egalitarianism. African spirituality transformed the version of American Southern Christianity that most blacks encountered and rendered it more humane, compassionate, and liberating. African spiritual paradigms maintained that there was no strict separation between the sacred and the secular. The African truth is oral and not contained in a book, and that the experience of faith is communal rather than an individual or personal possession or experience. Finally, in the African sacred cosmos, faith is sung, danced, and performed ritually rather than captured in rigid dogmas and doctrines. This was also the context in which blacks encountered the English language Bible, and particularly the Exodus motif or theme in that Hebrew Bible. Historian Perry Miller, in his book Errand into the Wilderness, says the Puritans saw themselves not merely as a Christian reform movement as they arrived, but as God's recreation of the people of Israel. Their flight from persecution in England reenacted the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. Just as the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and entered into the wilderness of Sinai, the Puritans sailed the Atlantic Ocean and settled in the American wilderness. Indeed, America's place in the community of nations is so unique that it seems to invite such theological explanation. Surely it was appealing and compelling and easy to believe that Americans were the new Israel, even amidst the hardships of early settlement, where one historian noted poignantly that during the first New England winter, the colonists constructed more coffins than homes. Blacks heard this same Exodus motif in or near the Puritan houses of worship, analyzed them, examined the unethical behavior of many of the slaveholders, and countered that, in fact, enslaved Africans were the new Israel, and the Anglo-slaveholding political economy was the new Egypt. African spiritual hermeneutics helped to underwrite this existential and theological claim. But it meant little until it was translated into social ethical action. This is where it gets interesting, subversive, and dangerous for the status quo. Just as God had authorized an exodus in biblical times, God could and probably would once again authorize and facilitate a revolution in the political economy of slavery to enable African freedom. How else could one interpret Jefferson's observation ensconced in marble in his monument on the National Mall today? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, end quote. Now, this Exodus motif is central to Black American religious mythology and self-understanding, and it helps to underwrite a theory of human rights rooted in a political interpretation of biblical narrative. The extraordinary film 12 Years a Slave, recounting the life experiences of Solomon Northup, a free black man in the North who's captured and enslaved for a dozen years on a southern plantation, also underscores an example of this quest for exodus at an individual level. Although Northrup's story seems more inspired or parallel to Homer's Odysseus on his epic journey from a faraway island back to a wife and grown children, wondering and waiting for reunion. Now, that same spiritual paradigm, the Exodus motif, enabled black people to focus on the rights in civil rights as a useful, elegant way to speak about a gift or set of gifts that God conferred. I think this is quite similar in some ways to claims that Stanley is making. Rights are one way that humans translate and manifest God's will and prerogative to endow humans with capacities, qualities, and characteristics that require cultivation, community, nurture, and discipline. But liberty and community are preconditions for human flourishing and must be in place to actualize those inner gifts and potential. That is why people start revolutions in places like Lexington and Concord, Paris and St. Petersburg, Montgomery and Birmingham. If I may requisition your ears for a brief digression, recently I visited Colonial Williamsburg for a small conference on the future of Europe. Williamsburg was established in 1607 as the first permanent English settlement in North America on the banks of the James River. Famine, disease, and conflict with the local Native American tribes threatened its existence for the first few years. Later, it became the home of America's second oldest college, William and Mary, in 1693, 57 years after Harvard. After Jamestown burned in 1698, Williamsburg became the center of government, education, and culture in the colony of Virginia. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, James Monroe, and James Madison worked here to craft the version of democracy that W.E.B. Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, the first African-American to earn a PhD at Harvard University in 1900, Du Bois characterized their work at Williamsburg as crafting a version of democracy that still required further rehabilitation. Today, as many of you know, Colonial Williamsburg is something of a living museum with original structures or replicas thereof maintained, and there are reenactors on the streets moving about as the colonists did in the 17th century. Now, during the conference convened by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, attendees addressed such questions as, can Europeans develop a sense of Europeanness parallel to our sense of Americanness? Should there be a United States of Europe? And what might modern Europeans learn from the colonial American past and our evolution from colony to republic to global superpower? Noticeably missing from the discourse, and I was an observer, of these government officials, former ambassadors, leading scholars and journalists from Europe and the US, was any mention of how religions had contributed historically to European fragmentation, quests for empire, homogeneity, and hegemony. This lively subject matter was rendered more urgent and fascinating by the recent unpleasantries in Crimea and the presumed intent of Vladimir Putin to reconstruct the dismantled Soviet Union. Clumsily juxtaposed alongside this breaking news in Eastern Europe was the fact of our location near Jamestown, where the Virginia colony began in 1607. But Jamestown was important because it was there in 1619, 12 years after the colonists first arrived, that the first 20 Africans arrived as indentured servants. After working for 7 years, they were freed through a petition of manumission. This led to the emergence of a free black community early on in Virginia during the early 17th century. However, the practice of manumission, setting people free after 7 years of service, was short-lived, and as early as 1640s, there's evidence that colonists were beginning to use permanent, lifelong enslavement as a form of punishment for crime, the old Jim Crow. Later, legislation was passed to legalize permanent servitude for all Africans whose mothers had been slaves. I conclude my digression with the observation and the lingering sense, even as I sit here today, now of almost a surreal character to it all, just 2 weeks ago, gathered in Williamsburg to discuss the future of Europe and reflect on the evolution of American democracy. Meanwhile, the rebels, in that sense, were instructing their former imperial masters as Europeans gathered in the room listening to American scholars talk about the American experience. And meanwhile, Jamestown's history of slavery just down the road continued to darken the sky. And Putin's annexation of Crimea and threat to democratic self-determination in eastern Ukraine continued to call, and today calls forth, the ghosts of Austria in 1938 and Anschluss. It all haunts the imagination, but I return now to the modern civil rights movement as a mature expression of this robust African sacred ethos and cosmos that we've described. So the civil rights movement as a faith-based, congregation-led movement. Congregations in African American communities accomplished the dismantling of legalized American apartheid in ways that other powerful institutions could have but failed to do, including the major branches of government, the market, the secular not-for-profit community, and mainline denominations and religious organizations. The churches in black communities led a freedom and human rights movement that succeeded in what W.B. Du Bois called the emancipation of American democracy. And they used human rights language almost instrumentally as the cultural currency for framing their deeply held religious convictions about the dignity, sacrality, and equality of black people. They did not need rights language in their congregations or use it there, but it appeared often in their sermons, prayers, and songs, a kind of almost bilingual capacity being cultivated in religious space. Recall the words of the soaring hymn written in 1900 by the famous James Weldon Johnson, that educator in Jacksonville, Florida. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies, let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Now, this, the most influential hymn in the African American community, now referred to as the Black National Anthem, juxtaposes the language of liberty alongside the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. As the African sacred cosmos evolved into a liberationist black church culture, a bibliocentric narrative and lexicon affirmed enslaved and oppressed people, connected them to their ultimate concerns, and empowered them to risk their lives in a great social battle. Du Bois said blacks worked to accomplish something that few white churches or citizens of the day were pursuing: the total rehabilitation of democracy, the giving of another chance and a better chance to an offender society, a nation that had offended the Imago Dei within black bodies every year of its existence. America was guilty and ineffectual in extending full dignity and rights to women, blacks, and others. Now it would fall upon the revolutionary social gospel embraced by oppressed people to help lead a full-blown, robust rights revolution. In his remarkable essay, and I urge you to go back and reread in the book, The Gift of Black Folk. So in 1903, Du Bois publishes The Souls of Black Folk, a collection of essays just out of Harvard, newly minted PhD, and that establishes Du Bois as the leading black public intellectual of the 20th century. 20 years later, 1924, he publishes The Gifts of Black Folk. And in that collection of essays, there's this remarkable essay titled The Emancipation of Democracy. Du Bois writes the following there, and I quote it at length because his insights have not been widely noticed or utilized by the mainstream academic industry or historical, legal discourses, textbooks, and curricula. I quote, "Without the help of black soldiers, the independence of the United States could not have been gained in the 18th century. But the Negro's contribution to America was at once more subtle and important than these things. Dramatically, the Negro is the central thread of American history. The whole story turns on him, whether we think of the dark and flying slave ship in the 16th century, the expanding plantations of the 17th century, the swelling commerce of the 18th, or the fight for freedom in the 19th. It was black people," he writes, black man, "that raised a vision of democracy in America such as neither Americans nor Europeans conceived in the 18th century, and such as they have not even accepted in the 20th. And yet, a conception which every clear-sighted person knows is true and inevitable." He continues, "The democracy established in America in the 18th century was not designed to be a democracy of the masses of people. And it was thus singularly easy for people to fail to see, wonderful phrase, the incongruity between democracy and slavery." Both colleagues have alluded to this. Then Du Bois describes a process that I would argue was driven by the African sacred cosmos, although as a determined atheist, Du Bois would not accept this construal. He says it was the Negro himself who forced the consideration of this incongruity, who made emancipation inevitable and made the modern world at least consider, if not wholly accept, the idea of a democracy including people of all races and colors. Again, that from the gift of black folk. During the modern civil rights movement, the black church revealed itself to be an exemplar of the relationship between Christianity and human rights. The movement to participate in the rights heritage of America was nurtured in a particular voluntary space, namely the black churches. And I go on to talk about and describe in a bit more detail how in these congregational spaces, essentially a social revolution was nurtured and guided, framed by the brilliant Martin Luther King, who was familiar with the key symbols and language of the Enlightenment, of Jeffersonian democratic language, and with the biblical covenant and the Exodus. King could speak two languages flawlessly, but his soaring achievement was manifest in his ability to frame a little, seemingly insignificant struggle to desegregate buses in Alabama into a moral drama with universal implications. Now, we've seen how churches and preachers who were rooted in an earlier African sacred cosmos and grassroots Christian ethics drove the movement to dismantle institutionalized racism and demand political and social revolution. Again, I argue that there has been a kind of instrumental use of rights language as the currency of the realm. But more profoundly, and underwriting that was a deeper narrative brought to this country in the African religious traditions and fused with Hebrew and Christian traditions in this country. I'll wrap up by simply noting that in 2010, Michelle Alexander published an important book that's called Attention to an Important Crisis in Our Nation. She talks about the struggle of moving this issue to the front burner, even in clergy circles where people were reluctant to talk about the mass incarceration particularly of African American youth. I think the good news today, and she notes in one quote, a movement to end mass incarceration is being born at precisely the same moment that politicians across the political spectrum are beginning to wonder aloud whether our prison building mania has gone too far, and whether harsh drug sentences and legal discrimination against people with criminal records may be causing more problems than they solve. There are a number of measures that I understand the Attorney General, Eric Holder, is beginning to entertain to look at alternatives to this mass incarceration challenge. I call attention to a number of those and celebrate that finally we are beginning to entertain a more rational approach. We're beginning to take seriously and admit that the indigent do not receive adequate legal representation. States and municipalities are cutting funding for providing adequate public defenders with reasonable caseloads. And so it seems to me we are now in living through a time of transition, which I find to be exceedingly hopeful. I conclude with a quotation from Michelle Alexander. Her book, The New Jim Crow, I think has helped to open space for a new conversation about what's happening to these young people. The time has come for a bold and inspired human rights movement to end mass incarceration in the United States. We might say that the time has come for American congregations, these are my words, American congregations, black and white, Hispanic and Asian, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and others, straight, gay, and others, to create a coalition of conscience. Back to Dr. King's observation, faith communities must function as the conscience of the state and the society. Create a coalition of conscience to challenge the social evil of mass incarceration and the suffocation of the dreams and the hopes of young, clueless, prodigal sons and daughters. And may those same emancipating energies sweep throughout the globe, releasing all captives and unleashing hope and redemption. Let us tremble with Jefferson as we consider that God is just and God will not sleep forever. And let us hear the charge attributed to the first century Rabbi Hillel, that the world is equally balanced between good and evil, and our next act will tip the scale. Thank you.
Well, that was fabulous. You can see why we're so excited to have back on this campus in the Laney Professorship of Moral Leadership on the campus, Mr. President, Robert Franklin. We've had a wonderful three-episode tour of the subtleties that go around hard questions of Christianity and faith traditions and human rights. We've had exquisite invocations of bodies of specialist literature. We've heard the names of sages like Simone Weil and Rowan Williams and W.E.B. Du Bois, who have been held up as exemplars of thinking and patterns of action and advocacy that are still critical for us in the 21st century. And what we're going to do now is to shift from your passive listening to your freedom of speech and your ability to articulate your own views about some of these hard questions that we've heard addressed today, to use the microphones in the middle of the room to put questions to our speakers. You can put questions to one or to all of them. My request for you is twofold. One of them is to be brief and succinct, and secondly, to be respectful. We are dealing with difficult topics, sometimes topics which inflame, and brief, respectful interventions inviting further commentary by our three panelists are most welcome. I'm going to recognize you in turn from left to right and right to left. I mean no political commentary on starting at my left. I will also invite our speakers to the extent they feel comfortable to put questions to each other or make comments about each other's remarks or responses. Madam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is addressed to all of the panelists. Right here in DeKalb County, Judge Oscar Mitchell sent Dr. Martin Luther King to jail for violation of probation because he didn't know that he was on probation. However, it was Donald Hollowell, attorney Donald Hollowell, and others who represented Dr. Martin Luther King, and eventually, with the help of many other persons, gained his release from the state penitentiary. This also involved John F. Kennedy, as well as Robert Kennedy, involved in getting Dr. Martin Luther King released from prison. He was on violation of probation. He didn't know he was on probation, but he was arrested for picketing in downtown Atlanta or in Albany. I cannot remember the one. But the question is, Dr. Franklin, you have mentioned the plight that public defenders have in the state of Georgia with the cuts to the Georgia Public Defender Standards Council. But Dr. Donald Hollowell, Horace T. Ward, Constance Baker Motley, and Howard Moore, of which I worked for years ago, stood at 859 and a half Hunter Street, and they were solo practitioners, worked together to do what they could for the civil rights movement. So how can we, knowing that the state funding is going to be cut, be involved in actively ensuring humanitarian rights?
Dr. Franklin and any other panelist that wants to comment.
Well, very briefly, and thank you for invoking important history. You'd be pleased to know that had time permitted, you would have seen some of the names you invoked there who were certainly mentors and towering figures on the social and moral community of Georgia. But certainly Constance Baker Motley is a brilliant woman who helped to lead this important rights revolution. I think that we ought to formulate those demands. We need to educate the public first, but then to frame those as matters on which we can apply pressure to elected officials today. I think they need to understand the plight of young people who disproportionately, especially poorer, and kids of color, but not just kids of color, the white poor, who are incarcerated at disproportionate rates because they lack decent representation, and make that more of a political deal than it is. I've been surprised that it is not a matter of public outrage.
I think one of the difficulties with rights language is what it does to the historical memory. And namely, you don't need to remember, you just need to make your claim. And I think America is suffering from what I call the failure of the success of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King is thought now to be a civil rights hero, has his own holiday. There are civil rights. African Americans can move to Decatur, have 2 cars, 3 TVs, and worry about Jews moving in, so what was a little slavery between friends? I think exactly what it means to come to terms with the fact that we were a slave nation. We're just not doing. And the language of rights doesn't help you do that. How you understand that memory necessarily functioning within your life today for the formation of more nearly just societies in which, African Americans have a story we don't want to know as Americans. And that, I take that to be one of the great challenges before us.
The question of whether it has to be an either or. A right to due process and adequate representation is partly what's at stake here. And the interesting thing is that public defenders carry massive loads with a $30,000 a year salary supporting their work. The average public defender has 32 files open at once, 22 of which are for major felonies, which carry with them sentences of 5 years or more. 92% of those cases get plea bargained, and they are dispatched in less than 5 minutes in a court with a 5-year plus sentence attached. And disproportionately, the defendant in the case is an African American. And that reality is just brutally clear. The statistical evidence is overwhelming. And the question is what do we do? Yes, rehabilitate memory. Yes, rehabilitate common good. Yes, also, I suggest, talk about rights and the right to due process and what ultimately that means, and finding a way to do that in a constructive manner that would summon the resources of local and state and federal authorities to begin to recognize how important this is critical. And I have stepped on the toes of my distinguished colleague, Nigel Bigger, whom I see peripherally.
Does this work? Pull up a chair, John.
I couldn't resist, forgive me.
That's good.
Since I'm not from here, as you may have guessed, I wasn't going to comment. But although I can't address the lady's own question directly, what she says does raise some important issues. One, it seems to me that the main point is that the kind of justice that can be done does depend on what you can afford. And it seems to me that the primary responsibility of government is to defend the poor, and therefore there's a heavy duty on government to make sure that the poor have access to the courts. And if that costs, then that should be paid. Having said that, I'm reminded that in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, it was at one point estimated that if it was attempted to put all of those accused of genocidal activity through Western judicial procedures, it would take 200 years to process the cases. As a consequence of which, the Rwandans decided not to process the cases according to normal Western procedure, but to adopt more traditional methods, which, from our point of view, would be less safe. I guess that this is just another instance of the point I've been trying to make, that in certain cases at least, social costs may require a compromise of standards that we have built up over the centuries. But I refuse to believe that it's only now with our procedures that justice was first done on the earth. We may have safer justice now than we've had before, but justice has been done in cruder systems.
Amen. Mr. Woodward.
Thank you. Oh, is this on? All right, thanks. My question is specifically directed to Dr. Hauer-Wass, but I invite commentary from the rest of the panel on his answer. It's regarding your remarks on obligations, using obligation language instead of rights. And it seems as though since the Enlightenment that rights language has formed this kind of common vernacular that allows differing religious groups in a pluralistic society to translate their moral claims from theology into common reasons that other people who don't share their belief in God can recognize. And it seems like other people may be more willing to recognize rights that a religious person might assert than obligations that that religious person has from their God that they think other people should respect. So my question is, do you think that obligations language can fill that same role as opposed to rights language in forming a common vernacular, a common form of conversation between different religious and theological groups in a pluralistic society?
No. Obligations will, as they suggest, depend upon the development of forms of life in which the specificity is not going to be easily translatable. It does mean that, she was trying to gesture toward, there's a kind of mysticism of the recognition of a human being that's in that language that which I don't want to deny, but I don't think there's much guarantee that it will do what you suggest needs to be done. Secondly, I don't believe in translation. If I called you an asshole right now, you would think it would be a term of derision. But from where I come from, it's a term of endearment after you've scored a touchdown. When it's also permissible for males to touch one another without a big word being put on it. So I think that the language of translation is very complicated. You can translate sentences, maybe paragraphs, but translating a living language, this is McIntyre's point against Davidson, is I think a very difficult business. It doesn't mean that there's not possibilities of discoveries of agreements and judgments, but it has to be discoveries of people actually talking with one another.
It seems to me that rights language, although it might provide terms in which we can discuss and articulate certain aspects of moral life, in the view of many religions, is precisely not fit for the job, because many religions, certainly speaking for my own Christian one, and I imagine for Islam, and pretty certainly for Confucianism, social obligation actually is the more natural term, and the notion that human beings, we actually find our fulfillment in meeting our social obligations, that's common sense for many of us who are religious. And so whatever human rights discourse does, and it does important things, I don't deny that, for some reason it seems to suck the oxygen out of other forms of moral discourse. And this is something Stanley alluded to. What I don't understand, I'm trying to understand, is why it does that. I now agree it's not because the notion of a subjective right is somehow intrinsically tied to a kind of Hobbesian individualism. I don't believe that that's the case. But in fact, in our culture now, it often is. And I don't quite understand why.
Madam. Robert, do you want to
all
speak to
our
this? Forgive me. Forgive me. I
No,
stepped on his freedom and his right to speak. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate it. I think he's on to something important in terms of how a diverse and pluralistic community has the same conversation about what is good for human beings. And when one segment of that community finds, whether they are women or the LGBT community or whomever it might be, a minority group in the society finds that, well, gee, there's this wonderful conversation going on, this democratic experiment, and we are being systematically, legally excluded from it. We have our own story. We know that we're wonderful and beautiful and ought to be a part of that story, but how do we break in? I think this is the power of what King is doing in utilizing both rights language and obligation language. You know, you promised on paper that all people possess these rights. Then extend those rights to all people. And so he's pressing the logic of the rights language that was reified in the dominant culture. Is it ideal? No, but I think it was good enough, and it's this sense of this proximal good in light of kind of Hobbesian anthropology and state of nature. You know, that makes sense to a lot of oppressed people. What they experience is a kind of Hobbesian-like social environment from which they're excluded and which they are often found the bodies that you both talked about dangling from trees because those people were not regarded as humans. So rights language was instrumentally embraced, utilized, not reified and absolutized, rarely used in churches, but used there only to the extent that it was necessary to break in and open the conversation with folks who were simply not paying attention. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the speakers. I learn something every time I hear any one of you, so I appreciate it. Actually, Dr. Franklin has sort of stolen a march on me now in what you just last said. I wanted to ask for the whole panel, and perhaps going off what Dr. Franklin just spoke of, I'm in agreement with all of you when you say that rights language, certainly for religious people, has to intersect and even arise out of a deep conception of moral obligation and moral order. It seems to me what's strikingly important about the language of rights is that it does provide a language and a set of concepts through which people who are less privileged can make claims upon those who are more privileged who have failed in their moral obligations in some way. So I'd like to hear you reflect a little bit on that, whether and how rights claims might again, kind of intersect with the language of obligations and moral order to allow those who are less privileged to claim human agency under God and to make claims against the obligations that they're owed as human beings.
Well, I think the rich win. And
that's a problem.
And that rights language is very amenable to those that are well established. So I'm not sure I agree with the premise that it works best for people who are without those resources. The rhetorical appeal is powerful, but it's not clear to me, as I briefly gestured in the paper, that if you don't have enforcement, all the claiming for rights you want aren't going to serve you well.
Which is why ultimately during the movement, King makes this appeal to Kennedy. Someone, earlier invoked Kennedy and the Justice Department and National Guard troops and so on. It's just interesting that all of that state structure has to be invoked and mobilize to enforce rights for the excluded in the democratic community that reason alone simply didn't persuade. And so there was this need for enforcement. What does that tell us about human nature?
I suppose for all my reservations about the apparent absoluteness of the claims that rights make in certain contexts, I recognize that in terms of political rhetoric, in terms of an oppressed group demanding that it be given what it deserves, a certain unqualified assertion of rights makes common sense. And I feel the need to distinguish between different rhetorical contexts in which the words are being used. But in that context, I recognize that a certain absoluteness to the propriety of a certain absoluteness to the rhetoric.
Let's collect a couple of more questions before we take our break and enjoy some of the food and drink that's been assembled for us outside. There's a gentleman here, and I think a gentleman right behind you. And let's collect those two. Again, not a political commentary, and collecting questions from the right. The floor is yours, sir.
It's my left.
Sure. That's right.
Is there a parallel between African American rights and freedoms and the rights and freedoms of gay, lesbian, trans, and bisexual persons? And if there is, why have our religious organizations been so reticent in the name of ethics and justice to advocate on their behalf?
Well, you give me a wonderful segue for announcing that this very week a very important conference is occurring on the Emory campus, an international conference to focus precisely on the relationship between, it's titled Whose Beloved Community? So if you Google it, you'll find it in the list of Emory conferences, just indeed following this one. So tomorrow night, Julian Bond will be addressing the group, the gathered throng, and then all day Friday and Saturday, precisely to take on how is it that African American religious communities and peoples who were so adamant and thoughtful and committed to rights for African Americans and apparently African American straight people have been so resistant to the LGBT community's claims. And I think that this is a conversation that needs to happen right now as increasing numbers of people are reading and exegeting, interpreting King and his thought, and even his wife's thought, that to follow the logic of applying rights to all people who are equal requires certain moves be made in terms of acknowledging the equal claims and rights of the LGBTQ community. This is stirring deep currents in traditional Black Protestant culture, but certainly throughout America. I see this, tracking how this is happening and playing itself out in white denominations and organizations that are splitting on these questions, organizations that are adopting, well, the split itself is significant because on the question of slavery and race, so many of these American denominations split back in the 19th century as we approached the Civil War. So there are a number of fascinating parallels that I think we'll be taking on this week.
But I think that the differences are very real, and to get at those differences, the rights language doesn't help you. I think that the issue of race remains the great moral challenge before America. The issues that are being raised in gender and sexual liberation are ontologically much deeper and suggest alternative forms of life that we really don't know how to narrate. So, I mean, so I think that there's a mystification of when the language of rights is used, is assuming that you're talking about the same kind of claims.
Final question from our colleague here, Mr. Wood.
Thank you. So there's currently a Supreme Court case being heard yesterday and today dealing with rights. And I agree that often, especially when rights are in conflict, the discussion of rights tends to suck the moral oxygen out of the room and leads to, maybe unjust outcomes. So in the context of what we've been talking about maybe rights not being absolute and talking about obligations, what does that kind of legal analysis look like?
Maybe you can tell us what the case is before the court.
He means the hobby case.
Yeah, excuse me.
I know.
I think one of the issues that's not being discussed is when did contraception become medicine? I mean, people simply assume that it's a therapy. Why? I don't understand why it's a therapy. So that would be one of the issues that I think gets lost in it. I think that it's one of those anomalies that you learn to muddle through some way, and the court will figure out how to muddle through it some way. But it's not. There's no rational basis for any decision that's going to be made on it, I think.
On that pessimistic note, I remind you that of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s great aphorism, where he said that all the great questions of theology, philosophy, and society must come to law for their resolution. And it's an overstatement, but it's also a brute reality, that we look to the courts, we look to the legislatures, we look to individual regulations to do the hard moral work that we have been talking about here. And yes, we do muddle through, but yes, we also have to reach judgments. We have to do justice. We have to give due process. And one of the interesting things about discussing rights and rights conflicts and the issues of individuals versus groups and the claims of religion and religious freedom in that context is the complication of the issues that is getting reduced by both the legal vocabulary and then by the rights vocabulary that's come before us. And in the contraception mandate case, the question that we'll probably hear a little more about in the second session later this afternoon with my distinguished friend, Professor Helen Alvarez, we're going to deal with some of those questions anew. But I think we've had an absolutely splendid first session to get us started. You've heard these three distinguished speakers advert to their papers and advert to, well, I've covered this in more detail, and that's a wonderful, wonderful luxury that we're going to be able to enjoy, which is to read these papers. And we'll put them together in a journal symposium or an anthology. If we can pry them loose from these distinguished authors, that would be particularly good for us. But we've had a chance to get a little glimpse into their profound worlds and their profound thought worlds in particular. And I think for that we owe them a great round of applause of thanks.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.